Spring, Minister Seriratu, colleagues, good morning, bonjour. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you here at the Shangri-La Dialogue for my first time as Canada's new Minister of National Defence. Thank you, John Chipman, for inviting me to speak today, and I thank James Crabtree and the entire team at the International Institute for Strategic Studies for compiling such a compelling and relevant program. My country, Canada, is an Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific nation. Mon pays, le Canada, est une nation de l'Atlantique, de l'Arctique et du Pacifique. Across the Atlantic, we have boosted our military presence in response to Russia's illegal and unwarranted invasion of Ukraine, which we condemn in the strongest possible terms. Russia's attack on a sovereign democracy has global impacts. For example, it has caused shockwaves in global food security and commodity prices, including in the Indo-Pacific. As an Arctic nation, Canada is experiencing the alarming impacts of climate change as our country warms at twice the global average. We are keenly aware of the security implications of climate change, which is why Canada intends to host a NATO Centre of Excellence on Climate and Security, which will share knowledge with our NATO allies and partners around the world, including Pacific Island nations. And as a Pacific nation, we believe that this region is of crucial importance to our country, and we seek to help build a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Here, we understand the value of this conference. Across the board, Canada believes in the centrality of what we call responsible engagement. It includes transparency, open communication, and adherence to the international rules and norms that have underpinned our collective security for decades. Today, I will lay out three key elements of Canada's approach to the Indo-Pacific, all of which reflect our country's commitment to responsible engagement. First, I will describe Canadian Armed Forces military presence in the region in terms of responsible engagement. Second, Canada's commitment to multilateralism. And third, the comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy that our government is currently developing. First, the contributions of our Canadian Armed Forces in this region. For over 70 years, Canada has contributed troops to the United Nations Command. UNC enforces the Armistice Agreement on the Korean Peninsula, and it is a perfect example of Canada's belief in rules, norms, and responsibility in state behavior. And I am so pleased to be joined here by Canada's Chief of Defence Staff, General Wayne Eyre, who was the first non-American general officer to serve as Deputy Commander of UNC. Through Operation Neon, we deploy aircraft and ships to monitor respect for another set of rules: UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. We recently extended this operation into 2023. Our success in this mission depends on the commitment of all regional actors to behave and to engage responsibly. Canada conducts its operations lawfully, and we expect our military to be able to operate unimpeded on the high seas and in international airspace. As such, Canada calls on all nations' armed forces to operate in a safe and professional manner and to recognize that unsafe and unprofessional conduct, particularly during multinational surveillance missions in international airspace, not only puts personnel in harm's way, but also undercuts international rules. And through Operation Projection, Canada deploys warships to the Indo-Pacific to responsibly engage with our allies and partners through joint missions and exercises. In last year's iteration of this operation, the Royal Canadian Navy conducted maneuvers alongside our international partners in the Philippine and South China Seas. Canadian warships also made several port visits to our partners in the Republic of Korea, Indonesia, and right here in Singapore. Today, I am pleased to share with you that Operation Projection is back again in 2022. In just a few days, HMCS Winnipeg and HMCS Vancouver, along with their embarked helicopter detachments, will depart for RIMPAC, the world's largest naval exercise, and then commence deployment in the Indo-Pacific region. In sum, colleagues, Canada's defense contributions in the Indo-Pacific region are meaningful, significant, and indeed growing. We seek to sustain, increase, and diversify our defense presence in the region through avenues like the new Canada-Singapore Defense Cooperation Arrangement that Dr. Ng and I signed just this week. This is just one example of an innovative new partnership that will bolster regional security. And as we face non-traditional threats like piracy, illegal fishing, contraband, human smuggling, and climate change, the Canadian Armed Forces have a great deal to contribute, and we are here as a willing partner. Let me now turn to multilateralism, a cornerstone of our approach to the Indo-Pacific. Le multilatéralisme est au cœur de l'engagement du Canada dans cette région et dans le monde entier. This year's dialogue is different than in years past. Yesterday, we heard a moving address from Ukrainian President Zelensky, which reminded us of what happens when power seeks to triumph over rules. We must ensure that rules prevail, that small states are not bullied by larger ones, and that all states retain the right to make their own decisions about the security and the future of their own country. Respect for international rules is the best tool that we have to minimize the risk of miscalculation and escalation and to avoid conflict. With this in mind, Canada is concerned with China's increasingly assertive behavior, particularly in the South and East China Seas. China has shown a pattern of coercive diplomacy, irresponsible state-backed cyber activity, and theft of intellectual property and sensitive technology. We believe that China's actions have heightened tensions and undermined the rules-based international order. In this context, collaboration with our partners has never been more important. Canada will continue to work with like-minded partners like the Five Eyes and other states in the region to strengthen international rules. And Canada deepens its engagement in Southeast Asia. We believe in the centrality of ASEAN as a vital forum for addressing regional challenges. Canada is one of ASEAN's 11 dialogue partners, and in 2022, we applied to elevate our relationship with ASEAN to full strategic partner status. As a group, ASEAN represented Canada's sixth largest trading partner in 2020, and in November last year, Canada and ASEAN agreed to proceed with free trade agreement negotiations. We were among the founding members of the ASEAN Regional Forum and regularly participate in its working groups, bringing valuable experience and advice to the table. And Canada believes in the ADMM+. It is an important forum in our collective efforts to bolster peace and stability in the region. Canada seeks membership in ADMM+, and we encourage ASEAN to grant Canada observer status to expert working groups. In short, Canada has a great deal to contribute. And let me take another example in the area of climate change. Let us remember that Canada has the longest coastline in the world. Given our military's excellence in disaster response, humanitarian assistance, maritime security as well, we welcome opportunities to share knowledge and collaborate. Indeed, the extension of ADMM+ membership to countries like ours would constitute a new and fresh approach to addressing regional security challenges and benefit all parties. Finally, let me address the path forward for Canada's responsible engagement here in the Indo-Pacific. Permettez-moi maintenant de discuter des prochaines étapes de l'engagement du Canada dans la région. Our friends in the United States, the European Union, and several European states have recently released comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategies. And Canada, too, is developing an Indo-Pacific strategy of our own. The strategy will integrate our actions across the diplomatic, military, and economic spheres, and it will be released in the coming months. Just this week, on June 9th, my colleague, Foreign Affairs Minister Joly, announced the establishment of the Indo-Pacific Advisory Committee, representing the private sector, civil society, and former members of government to ensure Canada's enhanced approach to the Indo-Pacific reflects diverse perspectives from across our country. Their work will build upon the strong relations that we already have. Canada is one of the 11 signatories of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. In fact, the combined economies of CPTPP countries represents almost 15% of global GDP. And of course, millions of Canadians, including myself, come from Indo-Pacific backgrounds, and these people-to-people ties are so very important. Stronger ties will benefit our Indo-Pacific partners, and stronger relations will benefit Canadians by enhancing our collective security and creating new economic opportunities. Our commitment to this region runs deep, and our new Indo-Pacific strategy will guide our efforts to build a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific where states engage responsibly, behave transparently, and demonstrate respect for international rules. To conclude, I will simply say that Canada is always interested in new, innovative approaches to enhancing Indo-Pacific security based on the principle of responsible engagement. Through closer defense relationships, enhanced multilateral partnerships, and with a comprehensive new Indo-Pacific strategy, I believe that the future of Canada's relationship with this region is bright. Canada is here as an enthusiastic partner with an open mind and an open invitation to work together. J'ai bien hâte de poursuivre notre collaboration avec nos partenaires régionaux en faveur de la paix, de la stabilité et de la prospérité. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, and also for giving enthusiastic and elegant voice to Canada's well-practiced biculturalism. That was a very strong statement of Canada's position in respect of some of the actions it has observed from China in the South China and East China Seas on cyber and IP theft. I might just note that historically, of course, Canada was a country that worked from the very early stages for constructive engagement with the People's Republic of China. If I'm right, the father of the present Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, played a big role in inspiring people to engage with China. And so it is no doubt with a degree of sadness and regret that there are still challenges of the kind that you've adumbrated that remain. With that, could I invite now the Minister for Defence of Fiji to address this 7th plenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Excellencies, distinguished leaders, government ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Bulbinaka, and greetings from Fiji. I wish to thank the government of Singapore and particularly the International Institute for Strategic Studies for inviting Fiji to speak on this session, and it is my pleasure to offer some insights on the topic of securing regional stability. The IISS Shangri-La Dialogue is a vital platform in sharing experiences and solving pressing challenges. As such, we would like to thank the IISS for this opportunity, and particularly we have learned a lot in these past 2 days, and see these as the beginning of greater cooperation amongst countries and, of course, all stakeholders, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, the heightened geopolitical competition in the Asia-Pacific region has been the primary focus of this dialogue and has attracted a lot of discussions. However, I hope that I will not disappoint you if I digress a bit and focus more on a much imminent threat that is a major concern to every Pacific Islander, and that is climate change. On 20th February 2016, Tropical Cyclone Winston made landfall in Fiji. Its 250 kilometers per hour winds tore apart homes, uprooted crops, devastated livelihoods, cost a US $1.4 billion in damages. That's 1/3 of our GDP gone within 36 hours. Again, on 17th December 2020, in the midst of combating the COVID-19 pandemic, Tropical Cyclone Yasa also made landfall in Fiji. Its 260 kilometers per hour winds destroyed schools, ruined hospitals, and ripped apart roads. This year, on 10th January, Tropical Storm Cody dropped 369 millimeters of rain in just 24 hours, causing devastating floods and displaced over 4,000 of my fellow Fijians. In Fiji, we are not threatened by geopolitical competition. In our blue Pacific continent, machine guns, fighter jets, grey ships, and green battalions are not our primary security concern. The single greatest threat to our very existence is climate change. and our hopes and dreams of prosperity, it threatens our very hopes and dreams of prosperity. Human-induced, devastating climate change. I must thank my dear brother, the Honourable Minister for Defence of New Zealand, in speaking so eloquently on this subject yesterday during the special event on climate change and green defence. Thank you, Minister. Climate change is a threat to our very existence. Waves are crashing at our doorsteps. Winds are battering our homes. We are being assaulted by this enemy from many angles. We are the blue Pacific continent, and we are standing up together, rolling our sleeves, fighting for our lives. This morning you have asked us to discuss a new idea for securing regional security. On behalf of Fiji and the Pacific, I offer two new ideas. One, security is broader than many of us have traditionally defined it. I've talked about climate change. Of course, we consider traditional and non-traditional threats, but as the Honourable Minister from Canada, our last speaker, has stated, that there are serious security implications arising out of climate change issues. Two, we have to adapt how we work and who we work with to achieve stability in this new context. In the Pacific, we are building our defense capability to rise to the challenges posed by this new, not by new hypersonic technology, but by cyclones, floods, viruses, and disinformation and misinformation. These are the front lines we are being forced to fight on. COVID-19 pandemic has left us in no doubt that health security is a central part of national and regional security. Indeed, in 2020, the Pacific region invoked our preeminent regional security cooperation arrangement, the Boe Declaration, to unite us in a fight against COVID-19. And the COVID-19 pandemic forced us, as a national and regional security sector, to form new partnerships. In our COVID-19 response, we saw how critical the whole of nation partnerships were in order to maintain health security. Our soldiers worked side by side with nurses and doctors to fight against this new enemy. And together, we saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. Similarly, we saw through our COVID-19 operations the implications and indeed the pervasive reach of disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation spread faster than any enemy advance we witnessed, and it threatened the security of our people. Seeing that what misinformation could do to undermine science and public health was a profound wake-up call for our national security considerations. We are now embarking on a deep analysis of how we can better counter misinformation, and we will again be working with a range of new non-traditional partners from across government and in the private sector to ensure that we can make our people safer and more secure from this threat. Over the last 12 months, the Fijian government has been examining its draft national security strategy to get a better understanding of how we, as a whole of government approach, can protect our people against the broad range of traditional and non-traditional security threats that they now face. We undertook a whole of government and whole of community analysis of the suite environmental threats that could have significant implications for our national security. We are looking at how cross-agency and community partnerships can be strengthened to form a novel, people-focused early warning surveillance systems for this broad range of security threats. The Fijian government, through my ministry, believes that the way we are going about enhancing our responses to non-traditional threats will also support our ongoing efforts and focus on traditional threats. We in the Pacific do not want to stand by and wait for the next disaster. We don't want to wait for the tides to wash through our living rooms. We don't want to wait for the next virus to threaten our health and the next lie to mislead our people. We do not want to stand by and wait for the next climate threat to become a reality. We want to be able to prepare. So please join us in this fight. In concluding, let me say this. We cannot deal effectively with our challenges alone, and we need the support of other countries and institutions in the region to assist, especially in information sharing and capability development. This Shangri-La Dialogue is one such platform that affords the opportunity for participants to discuss shared interests, challenges, and also new ideas. As such, it continues to be useful in assisting respective countries and regions work towards improving security and defense mechanisms in their countries. The need to continue to develop and implement appropriate regional and government policies and frameworks to meet the demands of the ever-changing security landscape are necessary if we are to remain relevant. The need to continue talks with relevant stakeholders in pushing for new ideas of collaboration and cooperation is necessary as countries start to pave a way forward after the COVID-19 pandemic challenges. Fiji, as a small developing state, will continue to learn and be guided by such dialogues, whilst also relying on its strategic partners from across the region. Again, on behalf of the Fijian government and our delegation represented at this dialogue, we are thankful for this opportunity. Pinang boleh. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that extremely powerful statement and a reminder that early warning to be strategically effective needs to arrive not just in time, but in respect of a variety of different types of threats. And for early warning to have strategic effect, it also needs to be acted upon. Let me just say one thing in introducing our third speaker. When the IISS initiated the Shangri-La Dialogue and thought about where a defense ministers' meeting might be held, we were delighted to be able to host the first one and all subsequent ones in Singapore for one peculiar idiosyncrasy that I think we both share, which was that the IISS and Singapore were both born into our different types of independence in the same decade. Neither of us had any natural resources on which we could depend. We had to rely on our wits and our strategic thinking, and that is something that we continue to share, and it is the strategic thinking from Singapore that we now invite to be expressed from this podium in this concluding plenary. Thank you, Minister.
Before I begin, I would like to, on behalf of Senior Minister Teo, my Senior Minister of State, Heng and Zaki, thank all of you, my esteemed colleagues, ministers, foreign dignitaries, guests, participants, for your strong support for this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. Let me also thank you for the positive comments and feedback that you've given to me, and I'm sure to John and his staff in IISS. And to the many SAF officers who have facilitated your time here. This is the Mount Everest of speed dating, so it's quite a remarkable outcome that you don't get lost even amidst the grounds of Shangri-La Dialogue, and it's to their due credit. Many of you have remarked that it was valuable experience, and I would just say this in terms of value, and that it is you, the participants, who bring value to the Shangri-La Dialogue. If you just look at this panel as emblematic of what we represent, You have Minister Anita Anand from the north. You have Minister Seri Ratu from the Pacific Islands in the south, and you have from Singapore, an equatorial nation. And yet, I think there's a commonality that brings us all together. Many of you, some of you, have been at the Shanghula dialogue since its inception, and I think for many of you, for many years. I think it would be fair to say, John, that this one will be counted as unforgettable and unique. I think it goes beyond the fact that we haven't seen each other for more than 2 years, and there's pent-up demand to meet, if not to dine together, but also the specific events. Yesterday, President Zelensky addressed us. As I was sitting amongst you, listening to his impassioned speech, I had a sense, it was surreal, a sense of guilt that here we are in these air-conditioned rooms, and he, in fear of his life, fighting a war, and we're asking questions. I think it's unforgettable also because since we last met in 2019, the world has changed on us. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine have resulted in a geopolitical earthquake that has shaken the global landscape. As security chiefs, we know that risks and threats to peace and stability in all regions have gone up as a direct consequence. The divides in our world have deepened along existing fault lines, shaped by ideology, alliances, culture, religion, wealth among them, and public health too. Vaccination rates for COVID-19 are starkly different for rich and poor countries, and this even despite WHO's warning that this disparity will provide fertile ground for new variants to emerge. COVID-19 has caused disruptions in supply chains, from household items to high-end microchips. The Russian invasion of Ukraine compounded this, with immediate impact on wheat, fuel, and metals. The post-Cold War hopes of a closer integration of Europe and Russia have evaporated. As a result, Europe is trying to wean itself off its dependence on Russia in energy, at least. This will take time, with Russian supplies at about 40% of Europe's natural gas and about a quarter of EU's crude oil import. For wheat, Russia and Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, accounts for almost 1/3 of all world's exports. Individual countries are shutting down their exports for grains and other food items to deal with shortages, compounding supply shocks. These aftershocks are upon us and keenly felt. Inflation coupled with supply shocks put millions, especially among the poor, at risk in all countries for access and affordability to essential food and commodities. In some, countries have turned more inward. Responses to global challenges such as climate change, human trafficking, terrorism will risk setbacks or fragmentation. In tandem, security alliances are hardening. Despite protestations and caveats to the contrary, partners are positioning and building up security arrangements, if not military capability, among their groupings. Defense spending in Europe will increase. Already 6 NATO member states have pledged increases of about $133 billion thus far. For the Asia-Pacific, it has already increased by more than 60% over the last decade. All these factors conflated together put us in a more dangerous world since we last met in 2019. It is not an exaggeration that we now stand at a potentially dangerous point in our history. The receding tide of global cooperation and goodwill have shown up naked ambition and vulnerabilities. How do we change trajectories and avert disaster? Let me focus on two significant foci. First, Ukraine, where, as we heard from President Zelensky yesterday, his government and people are putting up heroic resistance against the Russian invasion, a clear violation of international law and the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The Ukrainian leaders and people will eventually decide how this war ends, but a protracted conflict will exact a devastating toll on Ukraine, Russia, and the world. Russia has made a strategic miscalculation for a quick and easy win over Ukraine. To further their objectives, they would need a significant buildup of soldiers and armaments. The financial toll will be exacting, and conscription of Russians may not be possible without great political risk. For Ukraine, a protracted war will test the continued support of international leaders and incumbents. Inflation and supply shocks will make domestic politics challenging. I state the obvious, but a cessation of hostilities would provide reprieve to all sides. Second, to stop the contagion and avert a physical confrontation in Asia, our backyard here. If new problems arise in Asia to compound the situation in Europe, worst-case scenarios are in play. Security hotspots are known and not new. Disputes in the East and South China Seas, cross-strait tensions, instability on the Korean Peninsula, and the clashes in the Sino-Indian and Indian-Pakistan borders. But for Asia, we should make clear what the core issues are not about. It is not an ideological struggle between autocracies and democracies. Characterization and labels aside, Asian countries are too diverse and pluralistic, and there would be few takers for a battle royale to ensue on that basis. Asia must learn the right lessons from Ukraine. We must heed the passionate and poignant advice from President Zelensky for preemption and prevention. Once conflicts breaks out, devastation ensues, and a cure may not be possible. All Asian countries have expressed respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity as a fundamental tenet, disputes notwithstanding, even as recently as after the invasion of Ukraine. Indeed, for ASEAN, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia is a core instrument for herself and dialogue partners. For all Asian countries, we must ensure that our deeds match our words if we are to avoid a calamity like Ukraine. But while principles are crucial, they of themselves are not sufficient to keep the peace. For Asia, the core issue is about an interdependency that is far more developed, productive, and mutually beneficial than Russia and Europe. China is the top trading partner for almost all Asian countries. Even Japan's and Korea trade with China accounts for about 6 and 5% of China's total exports, and vice versa at about 19 and 25%. In that context, Asia must, for security, strengthen existing establishments like the ADMM Plus and step up engagements within and with other extra-regional powers. Building confidence and strategic trust in one another is the core of preemption. We must continue to emphasize inclusivity and multilateralism. The 10+8 ADMM Plus exercises held most recently in 2019 and before that in 2013 and 2016 are good examples of this. The ADMM Plus can continue to set norms and establish mechanisms to de-escalate and avert conflict. We have confidence-building initiatives, such as the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which all 18 ADMM Plus navies have practiced, and the Guidelines for Air Military Encounters, with principles and operational guidelines for air encounters between military aircraft. is the first of its kind. Let me thank you all again for your presence and contributions to this Shangri-La dialogue. Many people have made it possible for us to sit comfortably while we debate affairs of the world. I'd like to thank the staff of course, the Shangri-La Hotel, IISS, but also the home team, our police, and our civil defense force, who has kept us safe over this weekend, as well as my MINDEF and SAF officers who have facilitated your visit, your calls, and made the event of value to you. I wish safe journey for all of you as you return to your home countries. But most of all, I hope that this Shangri-La dialogue would have deepened your convictions and recharged your energies to keep our world and countries safe and free. If that was achieved, then that would be the ultimate value to all of us. Bon voyage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for first pointing out some of the damages that are caused by too much introversion, whether geoeconomic or geopolitical, and the damages that can be caused through an excess of protectionism, and also for your warning that if sensitive issues are not intelligently dealt with, crises can be followed by conflict, and that preemption and prevention are strategically vital to defend peace. We have about 9 or 10 people happily who've sought the floor. I can probably accommodate a couple more, actually. What I would propose is that we take the comments and reflections from the floor and then return to a final round from the plenary. Could I please ask first from China, Rubing Guo?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to raise the question. My question is to Defense Minister Anand from Canada. Around 80 years ago, there is a Canadian doctor called Bethune to come to China, and he has brought medical equipment to China, and he participated in the anti-Japanese war in China, and he has saved many lives, and he sacrificed his life in China. So Canada has a very high position, respect and reputation in China, and we really miss that. After 80 years, his fellow Canadians have come to China, to the nearby airfield and our territory waters. What they brought is not medical equipment, but fighter jets and warships. Just now, Minister Anand said that to participate in the patrol, I can tell you that since World War II, there is no problems or issues appeared between ASEAN and China. And last year, ASEAN and China are the #1 trading partners of each other, and we have reached about $878 billion in terms of trade, close to $900 billion. So we have very close relationships, and this is also a very peaceful region. For the warships and fighter jets of Canada coming to South China Sea and to patrol in here to show off, I want to ask you that would this behavior bring disruption and insecurity to Asia and to impact on ASEAN's central position in this region? Thank you.
Thank you. And now our guest from the Solomon Islands, Anthony Vecchi. Your microphone is on.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman, for the opportunity to pose a number of questions to the panel. My three questions, General. The first one is that do the panel think there are preconditions to regional stability? My second question relates to climate change, and it's more specific to the Pacific region. To what extent do the various Indo-Pacific strategies support stability in the areas of climate change, which is the biggest threat to the Pacific region? And my last question is, regional security will not be achieved without domestic and internal stability. To what extent do the various Indo-Pacific strategies ensure there are internal or domestic stability? And I am referring to the Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from the US and the ISS, Aaron Connolly.
Thank you, John. Minister Ung, I was really struck by your speech here 3 years ago, at which you spoke very eloquently and I would say elegiacally about the situation in the United States, comparing the high mortality rates for working class males to the situation in Russia in the 1990s. You seem to be questioning whether such a society could maintain the commitments that the United States has made in Asia over the years. I wonder, there have been a number of issues in American society since then, but there have also been significant political changes. I wonder if your view of the United States has changed in the intervening 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And from Germany, Boris Ruger.
Thank you, John, and many thanks to the government of Singapore for hosting this very successful Shangri-La dialogue. Singapore imposed sanctions against Russia in response to Russia's attack on Ukraine, and I thought the way it was explained at the time was also very clear. Singapore said we cannot accept the Russian government's violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another sovereign state. For a small state like Singapore, this is not a theoretical principle. So a very principled stand. In his speech, Minister Ng just reminded us of the importance of conflict prevention. And in return, I would like to ask the Minister, what is the most important thing European partners can do to help prevent conflict in Asia and the Pacific region?
And from Singapore and the IISS, Lynn Kwok.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. My question is directed to Minister Ng. Minister, could you please speak to how the Russia-China joint statement of 4th February has impacted China's reputation as well as influence in the region?
Thank you. And from the U.S., Josh Rogan.
Thank you very much. My question is for the Honorable Minister from Fiji. Sir, in the United States, U.S.-China competition in the Pacific Islands has become a hot-button issue. There's a perception that the United States has neglected this region and that China is taking advantage. I'm wondering, what is your perception of that competition from where you sit, and what would you say the United States can do, should do, ought to do to maintain these historic relationships? Thank you.
Thank you very much. From the UK, Ewan Graham.
Thank you. My question is for Defence Minister Inia Saruatu of Fiji. I would also like to thank the Minister for being present at the dialogue and presenting a view from the Pacific Islands at the highest stage here, which I think is important for our audience to hear. Minister, you gave a very clear enunciation of security perceptions from a South Pacific nation, and it was very unambiguous that climate change ranks number one, and I think that reflects the view across the Southwest Pacific. But to coin a phrase, you may not be interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics may be interested in you. And I would welcome your view. What threats potentially does it pose to Fiji and the broader region, and how do you plan to cope with that?
Thank you very much. And from India, Darshana Baruch.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. My question, too, is to the Minister of Defense from Fiji. Minister, you were the only defense minister at the forum who spoke about climate change as the foremost and central security challenge in the region. Over the last 2 days, your counterparts from bigger nations have detailed in great lengths their security challenges, which clearly are very different from the way you view the region. My question to you is, how do you approach this misalignment of the concept of security itself between small states like Fiji and actors that seek to provide security and capability to small states? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from China, Zhao Zhao. Your mic is on.
Thank you, Chairman. Shangri-La Dialogue initiated in 2002, and this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think it is a perfect moment to sum up what roles the Shangri-La Dialogue has played in this region. So my question goes to Dr. Huang and also Dr. Chipman. And I have heard a lot of views, and some view Shangri-La Dialogue as positive, thinking it's a forum bringing together high-ranking officials and scholars from this region to improve communication and exchanges. But there are negative views the Shangri-La Dialogue as a forum dominated by the United States and its allies, serving the interests of the U.S. and its allies. And also, the topics it sets often point to differences rather than cooperation, and divergence rather than convergence. So my question is, what role over the past years Shangri-La Dialogue has played in Asia-Pacific security, and how do you view the comments, the opinions I have mentioned above? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll both have thoughts on that in our last remarks. Thank you for inviting us to think more about that. From Singapore, Jayan Chong.
Hello.
Yep.
Thanks. So my question is for Minister Ng. So through the events of the few days, questions of disinformation have come up as just they have on the panel earlier. So in Singapore, we've seen disinformation relating to vaccine and the origin of the pandemic, as well as with the origins of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the events there. So I would like to ask the Minister what his reflections are on some of the limitations of Singapore's approach to dealing with disinformation, because that's something that Singapore has been trying to deal with quite a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ashley Townsend from Australia.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. My question is also for Minister Ong. There's been a growing amount of attention in Australia, in the United States, in India as well, about a role for the Quad to go further in maritime security provision of goods in the region. But it's also often said that in Southeast Asia, there are concerns for the Quad playing that kind of role or playing it more forcefully. From your perspective, what could the Quad usefully do to contribute more to maritime security in Southeast Asia?
Paul Henley from the US.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. My question is for the Defense Minister from Fiji, and it adds to the good questions that have been asked already on geopolitics and security. In late May, the foreign ministers from 10 island nations of the Pacific Islands met with the Chinese foreign minister to discuss a Chinese proposed multifaceted agreement, which we understand covered a range of areas from economics, investment, fisheries, as well as security cooperation. We also understand consensus was not reached on the proposed agreement, and I wonder if you can give us a sense where Fiji sees benefits from China's increased presence and engagement with Fiji and the Pacific Islands, and where you do not. And in particular, as Fiji's defense minister, can you give us a sense of what kind of security cooperation with China do you think would be of interest and benefit to Fiji? Thank you.
For about a decade, my local security partner for the organization of the IISS Shanghula Dialogue was the former executive director, Tim Huxley. So I'd like to invite him to ask a question in this plenary, which I think you deserve to do after a decade of service to this cause.
Thank you very much, John. My question is for Singapore's Minister for Defence, Dr. Ng. Minister, thank you for what you said about the challenges posed for regional security by recent global developments. But I wonder if you could say something about the potential ramifications of the war in Ukraine for Singapore's thinking about its own security and defence, and more particularly, do you see any implications for the doctrine, organisation and equipment of the Singapore Armed Forces? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And your near neighbour right in front of me from Singapore, Melanie Chu.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Dr. Ng about his comment about the strategic narrative of democracy versus autocracy, and his bringing up of the other issues that he was concerned about, for instance, inequality, vaccine inequality, exacerbation of global poverty due to inflation, and climate change, of course. And I'm just wondering if ministers' wish would be to make any changes in the global narrative of some countries, and if so, what would he advise?
Thank you very much. And
safety is my top priority.
that sounds like an excellent message for the Shangri-La Dialogue to communicate to the widest possible community in an inclusive and crisp manner. Thank you very much from the Pacific Island states to the rest of the world. Why not move to the present Executive Director of ISS Asia before we come back to the panel, James Crabtree?
I have a question for Minister Annan from Canada. There's always an ebb and flow of the aspiration of countries to do more in the Asia-Pacific region. Some of us recall under Prime Minister Stephen Harper that Canada made more of a concerted push to increase its influence in this part of the world. However, at that point, one of the main weapons in Canada's arsenal was its claim to be an energy superpower, one which both you and other panelists have revealed to be now problematic in an age of higher concern about climate change. Therefore, I note your forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy, which many of us would be interested to read. Beyond copying the wise and enlightened Dutch example of specifically mentioning the Shangri-La Dialogue, what will Canada do to make sure that its own Indo-Pacific strategy is sustained over time and distinctive from other nations?
And from Indonesia, Sophie Sierra. Sophie.
Hello. My question is for Dr. Ng. We have heard from other ASEAN countries since yesterday their response or even worries regarding the South China Sea situation. How does Singapore navigate this issue, and what kind of support you can possibly give to ASEAN in the whole situation, issue, or even cooperation or talks regarding the South China Sea? Thank you.
And Mariko Togashi from Japan.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. In the opening remarks from Prime Minister Kishida, he mentioned that one of the pillars in his vision for peace is economic security, which is interconnected with traditional security perhaps more than ever. And there are more and more economic agreements and frameworks in the Indo-Pacific region. How do you think we can involve more countries in our economic cooperation in the region, especially given the difference in geopolitical proximity to China? Thank you.
Thank you. And again, a tactical warning to each of our panelists. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then invite each of them to give their responses. Some of them will be clustered because a few of the questions overlap in the same order in which they originally spoke, so Minister Anand, Minister Fiji, and Minister Ung. But I'll take 2 more questions as you prepare and think about the responses. First from Nicholas Childs.
Thank you, John. Question for Minister Anand. Minister, you characterize Canada as an Atlantic, an Arctic, and a Pacific power. As a result of changes underway in the Arctic, not least because of climate change, the opening of sea routes, the potential increased exploitation of resources, in some ways that is bringing the Pacific and the Atlantic closer together, but it also brings the risk that the Arctic itself is becoming increasingly a new arena for state-based competition itself. Does Canada perceive the Arctic in that way? And in that context, does it balance? How will it prioritize its commitments as between the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Atlantic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally from Germany, May-Britt Stumbam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these very passionate, finally, speeches. And my question goes to the Defense Minister of Fiji. You said that climate change is an existential threat, but you're also working and fighting against disinformation, and you really emphasized this. So I was wondering, in those 2 fights, but particularly the latter, how do you fight this? If you could elaborate more on this, with whom could you collaborate? What could collaboration look like? And also the partners in this, and if European partners could also play a role in that, because disinformation is also an issue that has become high importance in our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, could I give 3 or 4 minutes to each of the panelists to give their final reflections as inspired by the questions and comments from the floor? Minister Anand.
Thank you, John.
No, sorry, I was asking Minister Anand first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then
Go ahead.
Minister Fiji, and we'll conclude with Minister Ung. Minister Anand.
Okay, thank you. On the topic of the first question and Canada's approach towards China, which is essentially the basis of the question, that approach is evolving to acknowledge the complexity of the relationship and the need to coexist with the world's most populous country. The strategy of responsible engagement that I laid out requires and calls for transparent communication, following the rules-based international order, and ensuring collaboration. And essentially, China seeks to achieve its geopolitical goals through a mix of political, economic, and military means. And the strategy of responsible engagement, therefore, becomes much more important. These means include coercive behaviors in the East and South China Seas, hostage diplomacy tactics, as we saw with the 2 Michaels, irresponsible and concerning behavior in cyberspace, theft of intellectual property and sensitive technologies. So the point that I seek to make here and in my remarks is that we must be clear that these violations of rules and norms cannot be tolerated and that they impede our ability to cooperate on global issues and shared interests. On the second question I received relating to climate change and to what extent the forthcoming Asia-Pacific strategy will support stability in the area of climate change, let me comment more on my file, which is defense and security, since that policy is forthcoming. And let me say, in direct response to the question from India, which didn't actually come to me, that we do see climate change as a very serious defense and security threat. And we do nationally and internationally contribute to efforts to address climate change disasters. The Canadian Armed Forces every year, multiple times a year, are deployed to address climate change disasters in our own country. And internationally also, we deliver assistance, tsunami, natural disasters, with our expertise in this area, and in particular, maritime search and rescue. We will be working to host the NATO Center on Climate Change for the very reason that climate change is a security threat. So I hope that responds to that question. The third question that came to me related to the high mortality rates relating to males in the United States. I was not at this conference 3 years ago. This is my first time at the conference. But I will say that I take very seriously socioeconomic, domestic issues relating to all individuals and genders and minority groups. And I would very much welcome a conversation offline if the individual who posed it would like to discuss that further. And then on the Indo-Pacific strategy that's forthcoming from James, we will continue to prioritize the way in which we think about climate change as a security threat, as I previously mentioned. But what will we expect in terms of the policy? That is what the group that has been assembled, the advisory group, will discuss. We will support, from an operational and military standpoint, the development of Canada's strategy. There will obviously be military and defense issues that will be raised, but the reality is we are here now in the Indo-Pacific. We don't need to wait for that strategy to know that and put that right on the table. That was one of the purposes of my remarks today. And in particular, Canada is a Pacific nation with a very long Pacific coastline. 7 times more of our trade goes west than east. And my presence here and my predecessor's presence indicates the high importance that we place as a country on the Indo-Pacific region. In fact, every single country represented here at this conference has a diaspora in Canada. And we will continue to ensure that we respect and uphold security in this region. And then the final question that came to me related to Arctic and Arctic sovereignty. And how do we balance and prioritize our priorities vis-a-vis the Arctic and the 2 oceans that border the east and west coast of our country? And the reality is that the Arctic is becoming an increasing area of interest for countries outside of our own, and that Arctic sovereignty is extremely important. We have taken and will continue to take all steps necessary to defend and protect Canada's Arctic sovereignty. That includes our collaboration and commitment to NORAD and continental defense. that has been in place since 1958. I recently visited Colorado, spoke with Secretary Austin about our plans to modernize NORAD and continental defense. We've invested in the maintenance of continental defense, including the importance of Arctic sovereignty through investing in the North Warning System. But this will continue. We will continue to ensure the sovereignty of our Arctic, including building on the 4 principles that the United States and Canada agreed to in August 2021: research and development, aerospace surveillance, command and control, and continued cooperation on those 3 principles. So with that, I will hand the floor over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister from Fiji, your reactions.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman, and I do acknowledge all the questions raised and particularly directed towards Fiji. First is the question on the US-China competition within the region and how it can be maintained and done better, perhaps, particularly in terms of the United States of America. We all take our cue from the Russia-Ukraine war. And of course, it will be catastrophic for everybody, including Fiji, if there is something that breaks out between China and the US. And that is why we all have interests in the development of the relationship between the 2 countries. Let me first say that we value our relationships with everybody. And of course, we wear different lenses as well when it comes to our relationships with all other countries. Let me also say that being small has its own peculiarity and characteristics. The Honorable Secretary of Defense did state yesterday about the need to be nimble and flexible, and particularly for small island states like Fiji. We don't have much to influence the world, let alone the region. But perhaps it's a question of relevance. And what can we offer? Again, as I've stated, we value what the Americans have done for Fiji and for the region, particularly after World War II, created that environment for a safe Pacific. But things have changed. And again, I've talked about adapting. Is it a question of the area being abandoned? Perhaps that is the key question that the US has to answer. But we benefit from all these relations that we have with our countries. But definitely, there are interpretations about the Indo-Pacific Strategy. While we look at the merits, some of the arguments briefly argue that it is just to contain China. So the question is, was there a vacuum created that brought the Chinese into the region? For us, and I think this is the same for every Pacific Islander here, all our friends and partners are development partners. We have the SDGs to achieve. We have signed to the Paris Agreement and the Shanghai framework. We have our own challenges, but we value the relationships that we have with our partners. Perhaps vacuum has been created, and this saw the active involvement of new partners. But for us, as small island developing states, we value the relationships that we have. And perhaps the question and the answer and the advice that we have also been providing to our friends and partners in terms of being relevant and what can be done to improve the relationships. Relationships, particularly, I think the Honourable Minister for Defence of Australia did state this yesterday, it has to be long and enduring. Relationships are built on trust. And for us, that is important. Being small, we have high hopes in multilateralism based on the UN Charter, and we hope that we will all abide by the principles of the Charter. Perhaps that is the challenge. On the question about the geopolitics, we are interested in geopolitics. It affects all of us, but probably disproportionately. It would be stupid of me to say that we are not interested in geopolitics, because it affects all of us. Again, being small, how do we maneuver within the dynamics of the current geopolitical climate? That's the key question. And particularly recognizing our interests as well. We have our priorities. We welcome our friends and partners, but we hope that you also align to our priorities and needs. Climate security, it's a matter of life for us. And therefore, my brother from the Solomon Islands talks about the Indo-Pacific Strategy, where the climate is in that, and well, under the economic cooperation aspect of that, we have benefits from those, because it affects economic security as well. But in the nutshell, we are interested in geopolitics, but we are vigilant, and we are smartly, I would say, looking at all the opportunities and how we can make the most of this relationship that we have. The priorities of our big brothers, I would tend to agree with what the Honourable Minister for Indonesia did state yesterday. Your enemies may not necessarily be my enemy, but we have signed agreements based on principles of equality, mutual respect, common interest. That is where we have high hopes on, and we hope that diplomacy will see us through in this. Again, I'm having problem with my, please, my apologies. This is the Pacific phone.
We have your number. Thank you very much. Carry on.
But again, the Honourable Minister did say yesterday, unfortunately, we are the ones that will prosecute war when diplomacy fails. Clausewitz says that war is the extension of policy by other means. So for us, as a small country, again, we value the relationships that we have. And I tell you what, our relationship with our traditional partners have never been stronger and better. But let me say this. We hope that it's for life. The Honourable Minister in jest told me the other day, when he asked me, where are you from? I'm from Fiji. Oh, you're very famous. I hope we are famous for the right reasons. Why is that, Minister? Oh, everybody's coming to Fiji, visiting you, courting you. But when will you get married? Let me say this. Marriage is about a lifetime covenant. It's about an enduring relationship. We may be courting, but, you know, as a Christian, we have our vows, marriage vows. The vows is like this. In good times and bad times, in health and in sickness, in richness and poverty, we will be husband and wife forever. That's our position about the seriousness of the relationships. It must be enduring, and relationships, again, are built on trust. Meeting with the Chinese, of course, everybody knows that we met the Americans, we met the Japanese, we met the Chinese, we met the Australians, you name it. I asked the Indian Foreign Minister the other day before I came across, High Commissioner, when is your Foreign Minister coming to Fiji? But let me go back to the China question. Again, China is a key development partner. And that is a known fact, and that is accepted as well in the region. A key development partner. And for us, we know that China has bilateral relations with all Pacific countries. At the same time, China has come up with a concept about the region that, that has been raised in here. And that has not been any consensus on some of the issues. But again, we respect that we all have the sovereign rights to make our own decisions. But at the same time, we also see benefit from all these relationships that we have, including China. What defense cooperation that we have with China? One, capacity development. And it's the same. We have our senior military officers and technicians in the US, in Australia, in India, and of course in China as well. Capacity development, because that's something that we seriously need so that we can address most of the issues that we have. And just on technology and other things that we need in terms of our capability development. We don't have much to influence the the vast EEZ that we have. If we cannot influence our borders, our EEZ, I'm running out of time probably, then we don't own it. We need capability. And this is something that we accept from our friends and partners. Disinformation and misinformation. This perhaps is a challenge that is common to all of us. COVID is new, and some people just wish to exploit that opportunity to create fear. And of course, from the Pacific, we have a lot of Christian denominations, and some are relating it to the Christian teachings, and again, creating fear and so forth. And most importantly, particularly on disinformation, this is the year in which we are going to have our next national elections. So it's just probably used as propaganda against government, because politicians, it's all about winning elections, according to the minister from my friend from Malaysia yesterday. But true leadership is about tomorrow. It's about the future. It's about our next generation. This is where the disinformation comes from. I'll end here, Dr. Chipman. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. Minister Ung.
Well, thank you. Let me just say that you learn something every day, and I've just learned that Fijians are not only good at world-class golf, and they're good at answering questions. And if John would have allowed, I would have asked you to answer mine too, but let me try to just take the many questions that we have just a few minutes left and try to give you an intellectually coherent, if not a satisfying one. The first question from Aaron Connolly. Anita has answered it, although it was meant for me, but thank you, Anita. I thought it was a good answer. Has my view of United States changed? It hasn't, because it was never as you characterize it. Mr. Connolly referred to a speech I made 3 years ago where I cited the fact that there was death rates in U.S. males. And since, like my ministers here, I remember every line of every speech that I've made in the last 5 years. I know exactly what he was talking about. My view of the United States has not changed because that was not the characterization at all. And just for a quick answer, I was trained in the States as a cancer surgeon for my postgraduate cancer surgery in New York and Houston. And to me, it was a marvel that you go to institutions in the United States, and as Minister Lee says, the United States is great because it creams from the rest of the world. It was creaming from China too until it stopped it. Now, to me, I think that's a mistake, but that's for the US to decide. So the United States has got great strength, and that's reflected in our foreign policy, that's reflected in our people-to-people ties, that's reflected in our conversations with American officials who know me well, and that we believe in the stabilizing force, the progressive force of the US in this region for the last 70 years. There was a question from Boris Rouge about what European partners, what would I think was the most important thing that European partners can do for stability in this region. And I would say first, presence. And I also mean military presence from the security perspective. And that's the reason why, for us, for our Changi Naval Base, we adopt an open policy. We encourage powers to use our facilities as they go through, of course, for peaceful means. And that's the reason why we have many, many ships from many, many countries. I'm not at liberty to tell you how many and from whom. But in open sources, you know that the ships from Germany, from Dutch, from France. There was one year when Madame Florence Pali visited us and brought along an armada, if you remember. When Ukraine President Poroshenko was in Singapore, the Russians did us due honors by also sending some frigates to our naval base. So that's our open policy, be present. But also, I think someone mentioned and asked about my colleague, Minister Anita Anand, find your own voice. And it must add to the stability of Asia. There was a question from Lynn, thank you. How did the meeting between, I presume you were referring to the meeting between Xi and Putin, how did it impact? It was interesting to note for many of you who were here this morning that General Wei characterized their relationship with Russia as a partnership, not an alliance. I thought it was interesting. But as President Xi described it, it was a relationship without limits. For those of you who have been astute enough to follow, they caveated it, and a couple of days later it was without limits, but there is a bottom line. And as General Wei mentioned, 2 days after the invasion of Ukraine, President Xi called up Mr. Putin and urged him to basically stop the war. I think as a strategic partner of Russia, there are many reasons why China chooses Russia. But there are many astute students of history. Your ally is strategic until the strategic ally becomes a strategic burden. General Chow asked SLD, and John, the question was directed to both of us, so I presume you're going to make a strong defense about the SLD and its roles, but let me just give my 2 cents worth. I've attended a number of conferences. I've attended the Sangshan Forum. And sometimes it's a matter of taste. I can imagine that people from the PLA come here and find this raucous, a bit rambunctious. This is the Western liberal mode of many ideas, and from this you're supposed to gain wisdom, and they go back and says it was thoroughly discombobulating. That's entirely understandable. On the other hand, when things are too structured, too predictable, people don't like to attend those because they feel that it's too scripted, that when you say things, the end is already determined, so why not say it and just send me something and I can read it rather than travel a few thousand miles to arrive in Singapore. For China, it must decide for itself. whether the Shangri-La dialogue adds value. There is no coercion for you to attend. Is it better to come to an open platform, to subject yourselves sometimes to a tyranny of questions, to what might seem a common view from others, to explain yourselves, or to retreat from that engagement? And that is something that China must decide for itself. For us, we'll take your feedback seriously, and I'm sure John will, and to see how we can make it more productive. Mr. Chong asked about disinformation. Indeed, as my most eloquent colleague has said, disinformation is the new battleground. And that's why we announced that for the SAF, we're setting up a fourth service, just like air, land, and sea, to deal with digital intelligence. Digital includes disinformation. And we deal with it. This is also in reference to Tim Huxley's question. Tim, it's wonderful to hear from you not from IISS. You're asking all the questions you really wanted to ask when you were IISS staff but couldn't. We take a view when there is orchestration, either by state or non-state entities, and where that goal and the motivation of the disinformation is to avert or to influence political outcomes that really should be completely to our own population, and that's the scope and the remit. Mr. Townshend asked about Quads and AUKUS. Let me take a leaf from the FPDA, which is 51 years old this year. And I think our staff did a good job in shaping the future in terms of remit, relevance, and reassurance, the 3 R's. I would apply that to any new security architecture that comes up. Completely legitimate for countries to want to form ones, whether it's the Quad, AUKUS, or anything else. But for the 3 R's should apply. What is the remit of this architecture? What is the relevance? And just as important, what is the reassurance? Melanie had a question about democracy versus autocracy and advice. I wasn't giving advice. I was just stating the facts. I know all of us, for those of us who are in ASEAN and Asia, know Asia. Now, if you cast the battle and you ask others to join the battle based on whether you're an autocracy or democracy, many countries in Asia would have a problem trying to decide where they fall. And they would probably not choose. And it's a binary choice. So that would be my point. My advice probably would be that we have to deal with it practically. You heard from Pak Prabowo and I think Hisham in terms of the Asian way and the ASEAN way. It might not work for many. It might be too conservative for some, but we'll have to find our own way. Just 2 more questions, and I'll try to do it within a minute, from Sophie Sarif about the South China Sea. Let me just give some reflections. The South China Sea is, of course, important, as we know it, in terms of it's a vital waterway. And what's happening to the Black Sea, of course, can be extrapolated to the South China Sea. What if what happens in the South China Sea occurred in the Black Sea, occurred in the South China Sea? And China, as you heard this morning, reassured us that China itself has vested interest in freedom of navigation. It didn't quite completely assure because there is still a tension. So I would say quickly conclude the code of conduct so that there is a game book, a rule book, so that you avert disaster in the South China Sea. Because the theoretical risk of something happening to the South China Sea as it did in the Black Sea is not quite theoretical. I think that's it, John. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. And let me bring this Shangri-La dialogue to a conclusion with one strategic reflection, one historical reflection, one vote of thanks, and one au revoir. I'll try to be crisp. My strategic reflection is that we've heard prime ministers and presidents speak here. It's useful sometimes to hear what presidents and prime ministers have spoken elsewhere and earlier. I recall President Niinistö of Finland in January this year making a New Year's address in Helsinki, 5-6 weeks before the war began, when there was a big assembly still of troops on the border, and there were questions being asked as to Mr. Putin's strategic intent or capacities. And he said in his speech, I paraphrase, but I think it's accurate, a known total aversion to war in any region only means it may find itself at the mercy of its most ruthless power. He had something in mind when he said that. And a lesson that comes from the recent experience we've had in Europe, perhaps to be considered and debated in the Indo-Pacific, is that a well-earned peace dividend cannot be fully spent or result in the dissolution of all risk appetite. My point is that throughout this Shangri-La dialogue, I think every single speaker, in their own ways, has mentioned the importance of adherence to a rules-based order. But there remain questions still about how to deter their breach, how to defend against their rupture, and how to reverse the effect of their sometimes savage violation. And I think those are things on which we still strategically have to reflect as we each go back to our various homes. My historical reflection on the Shangri-La dialogue is that the very first Shangri-La dialogue convened in this room in May 2002. It convened at a time when there was very serious, high-level international concern that there would be a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And on this stage, I remember the then Minister of Defense of India, a former trade unionist and a person who had great passion for his people, George Fernandez, in tears as he spoke, expressing his concern about how a very intense disagreement between Pakistan and Indonesia and India might lead to nuclear war. And the activity of a lot of the other ministers of defense that were here gathered was to have quiet bilaterals with the Indians and the Pakistanis to calm the tension and assist a peaceful resolution of a dispute that very literally could have gone nuclear. And I think the Shangri-La dialogue in its first year proved its utility to assist practical diplomacy. I might just note, since we have had so many difficulties in the last 2 years meeting, that at the second Shangri-La dialogue, standing more or less where Minister Ung is now sitting, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on May 30th, 2003, welcomed the international delegates to the Shangri-La dialogue on the very day that the World Health Organization had declared that Singapore was SARS-free. One more thought, and that is that in the early years of the Shangri-La dialogue, a comfort level developed amongst the ministers of defense who were meeting initially under very generalized topics about the future regional framework. Some arrangements that had been allowed to linger a bit long without senior attention began to revive. For many years, the five-power defense arrangements were beginning to meet at defense attaché and high commissioner level. When it became convenient for all five ministers to be present here, the five-power defense arrangement aligned their annual ministerial meetings with the occasion of the Shangula Dialogue and thus lifted to a permanent level their ministerial engagement. It was only about 4 years after the first Shangula Dialogue that there was the start of an ASEAN defense ministers meeting, and a few years after that the ADMM Plus and the like. So our effort is to informally, as Minister Ng so stylishly said, help to incubate a variety of different security relationships that gives diverse expression, as was so passionately expressed just now by the Minister of Fiji, to the need intelligently to arrive at the peaceful resolution of disputes. And I think the People's Republic of China has benefited hugely from the participation it has had in the Shangula Dialogue. It was fantastic that there's been a China-ASEAN meeting. It's been noted by everybody that there was a 1-hour face-to-face bilateral between Secretary Austin and General Wei Fenghe, the first face-to-face meeting between those responsible actors in nearly a third of a decade. And so I endorse what Minister Ng said, not only specifically about China, but indeed about all of the countries that come to the Shangula Dialogue, that it is what you make of it, and we invite you to make the most of it. My thanks are to, of course, our hosts, the government of Singapore, MINDEF, the police, the border forces, the health authorities, the many others, and as I said in the Astana last night, the people of Singapore for their warm and generous hospitality. My thanks also to the IISS staff here in Singapore, in our headquarters in London, but also in our offices in Washington, in Berlin, and in Bahrain, who have helped animate the attendance of ministers here. We printed 3,700 official badges for this dialogue. So while there were 575 people in the room, the entourages were substantial and important in support of the delegations. We had 59 nationalities here, 37 government delegations, 32 ministers. The IISS was asked to facilitate 127 bilaterals, but we know that there were many more that actually took place. My envoi is to all of you, the delegates to the Shangula Dialogue, for a safe trip home, and an invitation to the 20th Shangula Dialogue, on which the IISS and the government of Singapore will begin working straight away to ensure that it is a fresh reminder with lively sets of participants and an inspiring agenda of the utility of defense diplomacy. We will convene from the 2nd to the 4th of June 2023. I look forward to seeing many, if not most of you, there again. Thank you very much.